We're in the final stretch, folks. I respect people that listen for a long time. I know that's a challenging work to do, but be saving your questions for our last few minutes together. Please help yourselves to books at the end if you haven't taken another complimentary book, but also some of these books, like if you're in a church or a congregation, the kids' prayer book is used for children's ministry a lot, the adult prayer book, the Bible study book, and so on. So happy to make those available to you. Could we go back to slide number 60? Or we haven't actually been there yet. This is just that list that I read to you from James chapter 3, verse 17. And I mentioned I run this past leader sometimes. I was in a leadership gathering in India, and these are organizational leaders, and I find that people kind of flop around when they talk about the meaning of influence or leadership. But then when you say, well, what's your personal experience with it? By the way, that's a good thing you can do with the circles that you move in, is have a discussion with people. When do you feel like you've been led really well? And instead of talking theoretically, talk really in terms of people's experience, and people will be able to share something, most people, and what will come out is what's at the core. And it's along the lines of what we saw in this survey, is people that show personal interest and people that offer wisdom and so on. But just a little bit more on this list. What does James mean by this? Pure. The people who we deem to be extraordinarily wise probably are people who are relatively free of mixed motives, are not driven by personal ambition, and have generous, stable attitudes. This is the meaning of purity, and it's what makes some people open conduits of God's wisdom. They don't mess things up with themselves. They look you in the eye and see you for who you are and not who they want you to be for them. So the application is that spiritual leadership that is pure has a moral and ethical clarity. That's pure. Then peace-loving. Wise people are driven by a longing for and belief in reconciliation. They know what happens when somebody finds peace with God. They make every effort to bring people together, to promote forgiveness and forbearance. Their wisdom steers them away from superficial peace, because they know that the only thing worth seeking is the peace that transcends all understanding, Philippians 4:7. So the application of that is spiritual leadership that is peace-loving will bring people together rather than dividing and conquering. Considerate. This is not mere politeness. Consideration for people is a core characteristic of God in the Old Testament. He is the king who cares for his people at the same time that he rules them. And isn't it interesting that that word is used for God? So the application is spiritual leadership that is considerate, is always humane, just like God is. Submissive, which, by the way, is a different word from the Ephesians 5 Greek word. Thank you, Ken. Submissive. This is not weakness, but the willingness to yield. It's the teachable attitude, the cooperative spirit, the opposite of obstinate self-confidence. The application is this: spiritual leadership that is submissive is always improving because it's open to learning and challenging. And boy, I can just think of the leaders that I've worked with who they're learners. They just don't think that they know everything versus those that think that they know everything. And they have a hunger to learn. They want to talk with you. They want to network. That's a great quality of leadership or influence. And then full of mercy and good fruit. Wisdom is not passive. It's not the owl in the tree. It propels people toward action, but not just any action. Wisdom gives us a vision to see real human need and to help those in need with practical acts of mercy. There you get the moral quality of wisdom. It's not mere knowledge. The application is this: spiritual leadership that is full of mercy and good fruit is a gift to humanity. That's why people seek out people who have wisdom. And then impartial. In a world where people get ahead through privileged status and connections, wisdom rejects the games and renounces favoritism. The unselfish character of wisdom makes it impartial. So the application of spiritual leadership that is impartial raises everybody above the seedy side of human manipulation. And I really think that most people that we know, they're looking for impartial people. They want people who are playing it straight. They're not playing games with anybody. They're going to be honest with you. They're going to give you a fair assessment. They're going to be a good advisor to you. And finally, the wisdom from above is sincere. Anhypokritos, without hypocrisy. The Greek word non-hypocrite. The word hypocrite means actor, and today actors have more than one theater in which to put on their show. The television screen, the social networking website, the jackets of hardbook covers are ready-made stages. And what is played on those stages may be sincere or utterly false. So spiritual leadership that is sincere is conspicuously honest and thus able to engender trust and ultimately achieve higher purposes. And that's why I think people are looking for people to influence them with their wisdom. And it'll save us from a lot of headaches, and it will allow us to set good goals and right goals. It will help to restore the integrity of Christians in the eyes of society. I think in eras of church history when Christians did have the right value system, the right morality, wisdom, and so on, they distinguished themselves. And the growth of the early church was due to numerous factors, but one of which was in the Roman society, people viewed Christians to sincerely believe that they had found this singular, focused, unambiguous means of salvation and transformation in Christ. And I met a policeman who worked in a mid-sized city in China, and he was not a believer, but I found my way about asking him about Christians who lived in his city. And I said, I've heard it said that in your country, a lot of Christians are known for doing good civic things in their communities. And he said, oh, yeah, that is very true. It's the Christians that are helping to sweep the streets and to do other things for people. And even though he himself didn't understand it, he perceived that. So, any final questions about discernment and wisdom before we move beyond that? The question becomes when we are in a situation and somebody in a position of influence does exercise extremely poor discernment, what do you do? What do you do? Somehow they have to find out. Somehow that organization or that group needs to deal with the situation, and especially if there's somebody who they're making that mistake again and again, or in our own lives to say, okay, I'm going to do things differently because I've made one too many bad decisions. I'm going to lean into a different set of advisors. I'm going to slow down my process. I'm not going to be decisive. You know, there's a lot of different things that we can do to adjust our way of operating. So the last thing I want to talk to you about today is facing challenges. And this is where spiritual influence really shows itself. Slide 65, please. I forget how many years ago it was now, but you'll perhaps remember the collapse of a mine in Chile, And I think 39 miners were trapped in there. They made a movie about it. I don't dare watch it. I have claustrophobia. Is it 39 or 36? Anybody see the movie? No? The movie's just called 39, I think. But they were trapped like a half a mile underground. There was no alternative way out. Fairly quickly, within 2 or 3 days, they were able to drill like a 3-inch hole down to where the miners were so they could get a communication cable down there. They could pump in some oxygen. That's how they learned that they were still alive in some uncollapsed cavern. And they began communicating with them, putting a little oxygen, flowing some water down there through this little hole. But everybody knew that one alternative way out, and it turned out to be the only alternative, was for them to dig a wide enough hole so that they could put a capsule down a half a mile through solid rock and pull them out one after the other. Now here's the bad news, as if that wasn't bad enough. To drill that hole wasn't going to take weeks, it wasn't going to take days, it wasn't going to take weeks. It took months. I think it was 3 months. It's been a while since I read the story. I think it was about 3 months that it took them to drill that hole. And so 39 men trapped underground in the dark for week after week after week for several months. And in the end, I mean, the real miracle is they got every single one out. I mean, you go into a little cage and they're pulling out, and I've got to be thinking, okay, if I'm the guy who gets stuck halfway up, and that's the end of the operation, but they got every single one of them up. But what came of the stories of these men was remarkable, and one of them said, we all turned religious real fast. And what they did was some people who had wisdom in the group, they said, well, what we got to do is get real task-oriented. Our tasks down here are really simple, but unless we make it a real regimen and a real responsibility and a real task and a purposeful order, we'll just mentally lose it. And so they legislated an order, and then somebody began having chapel services, and so they had their time of worship, and they did the things that you wouldn't think that human beings are capable of doing. Have you ever been down deep in a cave, one of these things like out in South Dakota or something? I mean, I just can't even imagine it. But these stories come out, then of course there's the kids in Taiwan that were cave diving, and no, that wasn't Taiwan, it's Thailand. And this is just, 3 or 4 years ago? And floodwaters rose and trapped them in there, and an extraordinary body of people figured out a way to get, it took hours to get down, to get one kid out after the other, and what they ended up doing was putting them under anesthesia, wrapping them up with scuba gear and pulling, there's another movie about that. Anyway, slide number 67. Spiritual life gives us the ability to persevere and plod. Perseverance is one of the greatest qualities of leadership. You could say historically very easily that all of the great leaders in world history have had to persevere. They've had to go through difficult times, and multiple difficult times, and sometimes seemingly insurmountable difficult times. We don't talk about perseverance a lot because I think we don't like the word severe. Perseverance. But when you think about the New Testament writers, they often talk about the endurance, the patience, the suffering, the perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and so on. The question is, how does that work? Number 68, of course, when the unthinkable happened, when the Twin Towers fell, and I remember looking on the television at that massive pile of wreckage days later and thinking, how is New York City ever going to do anything? I mean, the mass of this building, just by itself, besides the human tragedy. And you know what? You do it one scrap of metal at a time, one piece of plaster at a time. We're getting to move our house to a different house after 35 years, and it's not quite as bad as that, but man, it's one book at a time, one dish at a time. Slide 69, how do you persevere when the unexpected happens? My wife and I and daughter years ago were at home, and at a noontime we got a phone call that was, my wife's got real quiet on the phone, and she said, Frederick Hospital, and I thought, oh, what is this? And she hung up the phone. She said, there was a paramedic call, and Christopher, our son, had been in a very serious auto accident. His car was slammed on the side by a semi-truck. He was ejected from the car, and he was being flown by helicopter flight for life to Frederick Hospital. And all of a sudden, everything went into slow motion. And we just walked through my house, my daughter, my wife, and I, we picked together a few things, we got in the car, and as we were driving down I-94 toward the hospital, there we saw the orange flight flight helicopter flying same direction. And I remember thinking, I don't know whether my son is in that helicopter or the body of my son. I don't know. And we got to the hospital and parked in a crooked way in the parking lot and ran into the emergency room, and a young attendant there knew who we were and said, you can't go in now during the resuscitation phase. Now, I didn't know that the word resuscitation can mean more generally just the triage after a traumatic injury. I thought the resuscitation meant they're trying to get my kid to breathe again. Could have slapped that guy later on. But anyway, we waited and waited. It seemed like forever. It was probably 20 minutes. And a nurse came out, and she looked right at my wife and me, and she said, your son's alive. He's okay. And it's the closest I ever came to kissing another woman, right on the lips. But it was just the most unbelievable sense of relief. We went in, we saw him, he was all cut up because his body had bounced along the road and so on. And in the months to come, we found out he had a spinal cord contusion and pretty severe muscular injuries, and then a brain trauma, frontal lobe brain trauma, which left him functioning, but with real deficits with organization and stuff. So what began was, I thought in that moment, everything's going to be okay. But we were really at the beginning of years of difficulty, and really to this day. So sorry for that long story. It's just what I really wanted to point out is that in life, you don't know what the next phone call is going to be. You don't know what the next phone call is going to be. And some people go through crisis that is very gradual and long and drawn out, and other times it's a phone call and you hear the unthinkable. But God is able to help us. Slide 71, please. William Carey, sometimes known as the father of modern missions, he went to India. And people thought he was nuts for doing so, because Protestants weren't doing that. Catholics were doing mission work in Asia and so on in the Middle Ages. But his father said to him, what can you do? You're not a statesman, so you can't help in India politically. You're not a physician. You can't help in that way. You're not an economist. And William Carey just knew that God was calling him to India. And he told his father, he said, well, one thing I can do is I can plod. I can plod. Well, he didn't know at the time how true it would be that he would have to plod, because he went to India and he had a few compatriots with him, and they commenced work to take the local languages and reduce them to writing, and then to produce grammars, and then out of that to produce Bibles. And they worked long and hard at that. It was a hard place to live. His wife had mental health difficulties. It was very difficult. And then one night, a warehouse house fire destroyed 17 years of work. Wow. 17 years of work and paper supplies from England and so on. And William Carey decided to just start over again. And he said, you know, when you walk a road the second time, it's easier than the first time. And I think, man alive, I'm getting a first-class ticket back to England. But this little thing, I can plod. Plodding, by the way, what does plod mean? Plod means to be able to walk slowly and carefully and with great effort. Maybe you're walking through mud, maybe you're walking through sand, but you keep walking. And I used this as a sermon illustration years ago. It's the sermon comment that I made over all these years that people have most remembered more than anything else I've ever said, because the idea of I can plod is that when you don't think you can make it through, when you don't think you can go any further, the question of the day is, can you take one more step? Today, can you take one more step instead of being frozen? And then another step, and then another step. Can you plod? And most people that I talk to say, I wasn't expecting my son to die. I wasn't expecting that divorce. I wasn't expecting the cancer diagnosis. I wasn't expecting to go through this, but when it happened, I decided I'm just going to have to not just take it one day at a time, but take it 1 hour at a time. And I can plod. And most of us can plod. And that's what the authors of Scripture meant by perseverance, is the ability to do that. And most world leaders, who are great world leaders, they, whether it was World War I or World War II or whatever the challenge, the Great Depression, whatever the case may be, putting one foot in front of the other and moving forward. And some people, once in a while, they are frozen. They can't even make one step. But that's not likely to last. They can get to the point. And then what happens is, with every passing year, was the case in the case of my daughter's passing, is 1 year becomes easier to handle than the last, and the next one becomes easier to handle than the last. And it gets easier, like a person who loses their arm in an accident. Your arm is still missing. You know, there's nothing bringing that loved one back, and though I'm grateful for the mansions of God in heaven, when your loved one is gone from you, they're not at your side anymore. So you can be healed and yet still have the absence there. I will tell you this, that the people that we influence, they're looking for examples of perseverance. So many of them want to know, can I make it through? Can I move ahead? And when we can say yes, that's a huge thing. We do a special service in our church on a December evening, usually close to the winter solstice. Solstice or equinox? Solstice, right? In some traditions, it's called the darkest night. Shortest day of the year. It's a liturgy in which you gather together with people and well, I'll just tell you what we did in our case. Our care ministry people decided for people who have been bereaved, especially in the last year, but maybe years earlier, let's give them an opportunity to come together on a Sunday night in December and have a time of remembrance. And so this last December and this December before, we have families representing 50 different relatives who had passed away, either in the last year or recent years. And it's just an hour of remembering, an hour of reading the names of those people and lighting a candle just in remembrance. And again, of being together, the power of togetherness. And that's oftentimes what perseverance is all about. Slide 74, please. I grew up with the space program. I was in third grade when John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, and then the Apollo program when I was in junior high school and so on. I followed it I followed it point by point. I mean, I was totally obsessed with it. Still to this day, I love it. I got a model of the Saturn V rocket in my office. Absolutely loved it. Apollo 11 in that July night of 1969. You go out in the backyard and look up at the moon and you think, there's two men taking a nap in a small tin can of a thing on that surface. Amazing. And then Apollo 13 came along. Next slide, please, number 75. And something happened on the way to the moon. A defective part exploded, caused an oxygen tank to explode and blew out the side of the spacecraft on the way to the moon. They realized their dilemma, and they realized that they couldn't land on the moon. The best hope that they had was to circle the moon like a slingshot and try to make their electricity and their oxygen last until they got all the way back to Earth. And the movie Apollo 13, one of the all-time great movies. I mean, it's an incredible movie. They did make it back, amazingly, shockingly. I always found it interesting. They made the box office hit movie not about Apollo 11, the successful moon landing, first time, but Apollo 13, the failure. Why is that? Matter of fact, NASA technically called Apollo 13 a successful failure. Just like all of us. We are successful failures. We are a contrast of glory and shame, of sin and holiness, and of struggle. And I hope you've seen the Apollo 13. If not, view it, because what you see in this movie is all of these people just scrambling, most of them young men in their 20s, a few women, doing these incredible things to figure out, and they persevered. And they made it back. And I think that that's what we're doing. We had a leader in our church have a moral failure, and it was devastating, especially because his another one of his friends on our staff had a moral failure just months later. I mean, it was like unheard of. It was stunning, shocking, demoralizing. It was unthinkable. So what do you do? Well, you just got to deal with it. I call these things harsh realities. When something happens and you think, this is the last thing in the world I wanted to happen in my life or in proximity of my life. But it is reality. It is reality. It is a harsh reality. I knew within minutes of hearing that my daughter had passed away, my first thought was, my family has now entered into a harsh new reality. This was reality, and there was no going back a few steps. There was no reversing that. It was reality, and it was harsh. And the work ahead for months, for years, was going to be to come to terms with that harsh reality. Well, that's life, folks, and people all around us, they don't know what the next phone call is going to be. They don't know what they may face, and they're looking for people that can say, you know, there is a way to persevere. There is a way to survive. And so I just want to close with a couple of closing comments. Not verse 77, slide 77. I want to suggest that there's a certain deliberateness of spiritual influence. I encourage you to think about this a lot more and to ask yourself, in whose life am I an influence? By position, by family tree, by work relations, by the ministry or the task that you have? Who is it? And what can I do to improve the quality of my influence? How can I engage with them? How can I spend time with what really matters? And whereas we may think that the things that really matter are the really big things, it's the small things. One of the joys that I had in my latter years as a pastor is I did a training thing for international Christian leaders, but it was only 15 or 20 leaders at a time for 3 weeks. We would bring them in from all around the world, from It might be 15 people from 15 different countries. And we would bring them together, and we would have 3 weeks of intensive peer learning. Now, I could say, well, we could have had a leadership conference once a year with 2,000 people. But I know in my heart that 3 weeks with 15 or 20 people was far more influential. And we didn't do it that way for that reason. It's just the way it turned out, because today, the 200 people that went through that program, many of them are denominational leaders. Our friend here, we know Emmanuel from Rwanda. We were just talking about a mutual friend from Rwanda, and it's just an amazing, it's the mustard seed thing. It's the mustard seed thing. Our influence, remember Jesus said that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. Sometimes spending your time with something that looks very small might end up being the thing that is really big. And if that's what God asks you to do, to be influential in 2 or 3 people's lives, and maybe it doesn't go any further than helping them get through life, that's fantastic. But let's be aware of what God may want to do. Slide 78. So spiritual influence is a countercultural movement today because it assumes that the best growth is organic and progressive. Discipleship develops over time. Character forms in response to hundreds of different encounters. Knowledge of God doesn't jump off a Wikipedia page. Next slide. In spiritual influence, we are challenging people in many ways to slow down, let truth percolate, develop many relationships that will yield many different insights. This does not mean slowness or sluggishness, but deliberateness. Next slide. Perseverance is a long view vision. The best work we can do is so important, so big, so visionary that it cannot be completed in one lifetime. Next slide. These are the entrepreneurs who start companies that they know will take decades to build. The social activists who take on issues like hunger and disease, knowing that there's no total solution on the horizon, but that any good thing that can happen today is a good thing. Next slide. These are the pastors who know that the renovation of the lives of people will never be complete in this life. Next. The very best leaders accept this paradox and tension. I will commit myself today to something that I will never see completed in my lifetime. But why would I want to commit myself to anything less? The only ultimate goals worth aiming at are those we cannot complete on our own. And one final thought from Hebrews chapter 11. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. I'm always amazed at the story of the great cathedrals of Europe that were built, some of them over a period of 200 years. So you're a mason who is contracted to begin work on the cathedral, and you spend your whole career as a mason starting the cathedral building. And then your son, who is a member of the guild after you, he does the same work on the same cathedral, and his son does the same work, and his son does the same work. And generation after 200 years, that cathedral is completed. And the amazing thing is that every one of these people knew that they would not see the final product in their own lifetime. But they knew what they were being called to do right there, right then, was a good thing, was a God-honoring thing, and they did it. And that's, I think, an incredible spiritual vision. So I'm going to wind down my talking into this stick, and I'm going to have one last opportunity for you to ask questions or make comments about really anything that we've covered today. What resonates with you? What is that you hope for? What are head scratches for you, or things you're wondering about?